In this chapter, the authors explore some of the more advanced and challenging stakeholder characteristics that go beyond age, gender, profession, or zip code. They also introduce some of the research and thinking on how cultural identification can impact how audiences receive messages. They define culture broadly as the groups and interests that stakeholders identify with and that influence how they send, receive, and interpret messages. Further, they consider additional stakeholder characteristics that one should maintain awareness of throughout the strategic communication process. This chapter also identifies the strategies for strengthening one's relationships with a diverse body of stakeholders associated with any strategic communication program as a means for enhancing the program's eventual effectiveness. Throughout the chapter, the authors also explore aspects of Dr. Krebs's project, along with a number of other examples to strengthen one's understanding of these important concepts. Krebs's project, the Community Liaison Project, offers some important insight into the critical importance of truly understanding your audience. Anytime public health is at risk, we must consider who is vulnerable or at heightened risk and why. In the example, African Americans and other ethnic minorities are affected disproportionately, suggesting heightened risk of vulnerability. Scientists rule out any medical explanation, and thus experts began to examine how prevention messages were being disseminated in high-risk communities and populations. Scholars have found that when healthcare consumers distrust professionals, they avoid the medical system and fail to comply with prevention and treatment guidance offered by their providers and public health officials. Some studies have also found that the effect of ethnicity was stronger when the individual also had lower socioeconomic status, and that geographic region or city and gender also made a difference. Studies like these reveal critical pathways to distrust in healthcare professionals that help practitioners anticipate objections to their messages and design strategies for overcoming barriers to reaching intended communities. Krebs and his team were focused on a message design program that would overcome African Americans' lack of trust in the message source and the message itself. Awareness of salient audience characteristics is essential for guiding the design and implementation of any program or campaign and how you interact with stakeholders. The importance of understanding and relating to your constituents extends beyond the target audience and applies to other stakeholders. You must be vigilant about who your stakeholders are and what they value, how they think and make decisions, and how you can illustrate the benefits of a program in ways they will relate to and agree with. Stakeholder personalities, needs, and roles were critical for the communication team to learn and respect throughout the process of designing and implementing the training program. Initiating, maintaining, and nurturing relationships with stakeholders and maintaining the integrity, focus, and direction of a program can be a balancing act. There are three defining characteristics that communication professionals should keep in mind as they evaluate stakeholder needs, anticipate their objections and requirements, and prioritize responses. So firstly, stakeholder power. Stakeholders that provide funding have a greater deal of power to impose their will. Next, legitimacy. Legitimacy refers to the appropriateness or desirability of a stakeholder's position or actions. And next, urgency, which refers to the degree to whether a stakeholder's claim is sensitive, pressing, and critical to the overall project. Stakeholders with all three of these characteristics at any given time are referred to as definitive stakeholders. A key to understanding strategic communication is understanding the diversity inherent in the communities where message design programs are disseminated. Cultural identification and communication are inseparable. How we speak, how we listen, how we respond to nonverbal and written messages, how we use time, what foods and smells we enjoy, and how we relate to people in positions of power and authority are all guided to some extent by the culture of a particular society or predominant in-groups. In-groups refer to smaller groups within society with which people psychologically identify as a result of shared characteristics or interests. Communicators need to consider the impact of diversity in their choice of language, in their use of evidence, in the selection of organizational structure, logical or emotional appeals, media, and as Dr. Cribb's health research indicates, message sources. What is culture? Culture is a term first introduced by anthropologist Edward B. Taylor in 1871 when he wrote, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other habits acquired by man as a member of society." Culture is what people collectively produce and do, the things they value or prefer, the beliefs they share, and the pattern of behavior they tend to follow. Culture and society are different things. Society is simply a number of people carrying on a common life, the primary features of which might be shared, but that is additionally characterized by great differences. Culture is an inclusive concept that covers different types of groups. Mainstream culture in the United States brings a degree of uniformity to the lives of people living in an incredibly diverse society. It allows individuals to communicate superficially with one another in relatively predictable ways. Co-culture illustrates the unique, specialized ways of thinking, behaving, and interacting that characterize people in particular racial and ethnic groups. Religious organizations, social classes, regions of the country, occupations, and so forth. Examples include vegetarians, Latinos, and the very wealthy, for example. Now let's take a look at a contemporary approach to message design. A traditional approach to public and strategic communication assumes that mainstream cultural values will outweigh those that emanate from the various co-cultures that people identify with. The problem that Dr. Cribb's team was confronted with was rooted in this assumption. The fact that minorities remained underrepresented in vaccine clinical trials suggested that what worked with other groups would not work for all groups. The traditional approach represented one of cultural exclusion or ethnocentrism, or, in other words, the tendency to perceive that there is one dominant, best way to go about something. Some scholars have argued that too many communicators are uninformed when analyzing the communication patterns and preferences of groups other than their own, and as a result, practice cultural exclusion. Cultural exclusion takes many forms in strategic communication. To be an effective strategic communicator in designing and implementing programs and relating to stakeholders, be inclusive rather than exclusive. You should make every effort to understand the complexity of a target audience's identities, much like Dr. Cribb's delved into the research indicating complex interactions of race, gender, and socioeconomic status to learn about his intended audience's preferred message source regarding medical information. In the Community Liaison Project, researchers recognized that the intended audience would prefer to receive information about HIV/AIDS vaccine research and trials from peers, rather than medical professionals. The team designed a message campaign that relied on trained community members as information sources. Now let's consider the cultural and co-cultural features that influence communication. The 3 points adapted from Waldeck, Kearney, and Plex 2017, who wrote about how culture impacts various forms of communication. We must never assume that just because someone belongs to a given cultural group, he or she will necessarily exhibit all its characteristics. The cultural characteristics researchers have identified are based on limited available data. We need to keep in mind our almost inevitable tendency to be ethnocentric. We need to suspend judgment and instead rely on the principle of cultural relativity. Hofstede identified 6 cultural features that make a difference in how people form relationships and process messages. First of all, individualism and collectivism. A cultural group with an orientation toward individualism places a high value on people who can speak or stand up for themselves and not have to depend on others beyond their immediate family. Individualistic people think of themselves as self-reliant and independent of social, organizational, or institutional affiliations. They prize individual drive and achievement, personal property, and the right to their own opinions. Examples include Canada, the United States, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Collectivists are part of close-knit, family-like groups who define their identities based on their membership in the group. They tend to take care of other members of their in-groups, avoid competing with them, and express respect and willingness to cooperate and collaborate. Examples include China, Iraq, Greece, and most Latin American nations. The second cultural feature is uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance refers to how members of a particular group deal with the unknown and unfamiliar. People from groups with high uncertainty avoidance tendencies are typically uncomfortable with ambiguous, unknown situations, and unfamiliar information. Examples include Egypt, France, Greece, Israel, Mexico, Japan, and most Asian and Latin American countries. Low uncertainty avoidance communicators are much more comfortable with the unknown and require less explicit, clear messages. Examples include Denmark and most Scandinavian countries, India, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. The next cultural feature is power distance, which refers to how groups distribute power, rank, and status among people. The US is a clear example of a low power distance culture. Others include Austria, Canada, Costa Rica, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Low power distance stakeholders are likely to appreciate accessible, approachable, and humble message sources, assert themselves by questioning message sources and critically analyzing sources and messages, and enjoy the opportunities for interaction provided by social media channels, and conversely rate traditional one-way message dissemination channels and strategies as less compelling. Groups that place a high value on social status, birth order, and occupational or political rankings are referred to as high power distance cultures. They include Mexico and most Latin American countries, China and most Asian countries, Iraq, Iran, Kenya, Morocco, and Russia. High power distance receivers are likely to appreciate message and message source formality, avoid questioning messages and message source, and be uncomfortable with the open and egalitarian dialogue of social media exchange. Next is masculine and feminine cultures. Masculinity refers to the degree to which a group values and encourages assertiveness, sometimes illustrated as achievement, heroism, success, ambition, and competitiveness. Examples include Mexico, Austria, China, Japan, Hong Kong, Italy, Iraq, Venezuela, the US, South Africa, and Kenya. Personal achievement and competitiveness are highly valued in masculine cultures. Relational concerns are secondary. In contrast, femininity has to do with the group's preference for nurturance, often defined as friendliness, modesty, affection, compassion, and general social support. Examples include Chile, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Costa Rica, and Portugal. Feminine-oriented cultures de-emphasize strictly held role definitions. The fourth cultural feature is long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. This cultural feature helps us understand how people balance the need for a link to the past and living in the present while looking toward the future. People with moderate to strong long-term orientation cultural backgrounds include countries such as China, Japan, and most continental European countries, are dynamic and forward-thinking, but pragmatic at the short term, or rather are pragmatic at the same time. In contrast, short-term orientation stakeholders, on the other hand, prefer to follow time-honored traditions and look to the past for solutions to present problems. And finally, the sixth cultural feature is indulgence and restraint. In an indulgent culture, people feel free to do what they want to do, to be impulsive, spend time with friends, spend money on themselves, and enjoy life. Examples include the US, Canada, Mexico, Ireland, and the UK, most of South America, South Africa, New Zealand, Sweden, and Denmark. Restrained people emphasize duty to work, family, and society over self-gratification. Examples include Germany, most of continental Europe, China, and most of Asia, India, Vietnam, Lebanon, and most of the Middle East. The communication competence of campaign staff is often the key factor in building successful partnerships and having lasting influence. How does the use of appropriate theory and research as your guide? How did Dr. Tripp's team solve their problem? They developed an innovative community participatory approach where trusted members of minority communities were trained by the researchers and became actively involved in disseminating HIV/AIDS information within their personal social networks. The community liaisons then encouraged members of those social networks to also disseminate the information to others, creating a snowball effect whereby accurate information encouraging message receivers to further explore HIV vaccine trials was spread by trusted sources. The original set of community liaisons collected feedback about the messages, the information about preferred channels, and media directly from the target audience. The research team implemented various assessments of the effectiveness of their messaging strategies. They found that loss-framed messages would be most effective when used with the target audience on print messages, and that game-framed messages will be most effective when disseminated through interpersonal communication. The team also found evidence of a significant increase in HIV awareness and community members' willingness to spread the positive HIV vaccine message further into their social networks. Interpersonal communication is a special form of transactional human communication that we use to enact influence and manage our relationships with others. For example, listening skills. Nonverbal behaviors such as nodding, making eye contact, leaning forward, taking notes, and maintaining an open body posture position all contribute to others' perception that you value what they have to say. Verbal listening behaviors may be even more important as you seek to build relationships with your campaign stakeholders. Listening styles refers to patterned way they process what they hear. It takes time to learn a person's listening style. Relational listeners focus on emotions and feelings. Analytical listeners tend to suspend judgment and listen to all sides of an issue. Task-oriented listeners are preoccupied with taking action. Critical listeners appreciate a lot of evidence and data as support for campaign recommendations. Next, let's have a chat about rapport building skills. Rapport is the ability to develop a positive relationship between two or more people that results in liking and mutual positive feelings. Two communication strategies for building rapport include using verbal and nonverbal immediacy and affinity seeking. Immediacy is the perception of physical and psychological closeness between communicators. Scholars have theorized that immediacy communication may help explain why people avoid or approach other people and engage with or resist certain issues or topics. Immediacy is an incredibly powerful communication behavior that results in a very long list of positive outcomes. Affinity refers to liking. These strategies are particularly helpful. Encourage enjoyment, practice dynamism, keep conversational rules, be comfortable, assume equality. In sum, your ability to communicate ethically with campaign stakeholders in both culturally and interpersonally sensitive ways will help you overcome challenges and inevitable conflicts and misunderstandings with finesse for the benefit of the project.